Hello, everyone. Welcome to the program. My name is William Hemsworth. Great to be with you. When talking about the Deuterocanon, sometimes the objection, cessation of prophecy comes up, actually most times, if not every time, and you'll hear it often. Our guest today, Gary Michuta, has dealt with this quite a bit. He's wrote many books on the subject, Case for the Deuterocanon, Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger, and he's done a multi-part series on his YouTube channel, Apocrypha Apocalypse. Gary, how are you doing today?
Doing great. How are we doing down in sunny Arizona?
It is indeed sunny today,
Good.
And my son was upset that he didn't have the right pair of shorts to wear. So,
Oh, wow. That's a good problem to have.
Well, that's what I told him. Like, compared to how some of the other parts of the country are, just be lucky you could wear shorts and don't be upset that your favorite ones aren't clean. That was the conversation we had to have this morning.
Yeah, send them up here to Michigan.
Yeah, let's say, how are things up in Michigan?
Well, it's March. It's not too bad. It's in the 30s. Not exactly shorts weather, but at least it's not as super cold as it was earlier. So it's cool. It's spring is on its way.
Yeah, I'll be here before we know it. The year's just flying by as it always does.
Yeah, that's true.
So, cessation of prophecy. When we hear that term, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, that's one of the big things about it. The cessation of prophecy idea, I think, has really come about through the Protestant Old Testament canon. That since it's assumed that the Protestant canon ceases 3 centuries before Christ, you have this, 4 centuries before Christ, you have the supposed 400 years of silence. And I think what happened was there was a kind of myth that evolved around that idea where they came up with an idea that all prophecy ceased. Well, actually, in some way, somehow prophecy ceased in those 400 years, and then it kind of kickstarts again in the New Testament. And, actually, the first question you ask is really the most important. It's like, how do you define it? Because people will just say cessation of prophecy and they'll just assume, well, it's self-evident what we're talking about, right? But actually, not really. I mean, there's a lot of things that could fit under that heading. So, William, let me read you some of the permutations I came up with. And because when you start looking at evidence, you find like some evidence fits here, some here. It doesn't really form a theory. But anyway, when you say cessation of prophecy, do you mean all prophecy whatsoever ceased at some time in the past? Or all prophecy that people knew as prophets ceased some time in the past? Or all prophets ceased and therefore prophecy ceased as well? Or do you mean that all prophecy ceased from people who were known as prophets, but it continued on through people not known as prophets? Or maybe the great prophets of the past, like Isaiah and Jeremiah, they ceased, but lesser prophets and prophecies continued. Or do you mean that the prophets that make up the second section of the Tanakh, the prophets ceased, but, in the sense that no further writings could be added to this particular section? Or do you mean that all prophets and prophecies ceased, but inspired prophetic scripture could continue to be written? Or that prophets and inspiration ceased, but different types of prophetic non-scriptural utterances continued? And so even just kind of defining what we mean by prophecy, there's a lot of different ways you could read that idea of cessation of prophecy.
So when our Protestant friends are talking about cessation of prophecy, I don't know, every time I've heard it, they go back to the end of Malachi and they quote, was it maybe I think it's First Maccabees chapter 6, where it said no prophet appeared since this time, or the time of Artaxerxes or something like that.
Yeah.
Has that been your experience, or actually, you're a lot more experienced in this area than I am, but what have you experienced with that?
Yeah, essentially, yeah. It's the last book, Malachi, according to the Protestant canon. After that, there were no more. Well, like I said, it's like no one actually defines what they mean by it. Usually what they mean is that no further scripture could be written. Okay. That's really the bottom line. And how they do that is they say, well, scripture is prophetic writing because it reveals something about God. So if there's no scripture, there's no prophetic writing, and therefore there's no prophets to write prophetic writing. But, there's all sorts of problems with that because, William, is every single book of the Old Testament written by someone publicly known as a prophet?
No, not at all.
Yeah, Ezra and Nehemiah, they're never called prophets. In fact, Ezra's a scribe and a priest. So, so right there, I mean, then you could go to other portions too. Like in Proverbs, there's some chapters that were written by people who were not known as prophets. So, it really gets dicey. It's more of an umbrella term in a way to kind of legitimize that 400 years of silence by saying, well, God just ceased to speak to his people during this time. And so therefore there's no prophets or prophecy.
Yeah, and last time we talked on the show, you had gone through quite a bit of passages in the Deuterocanon that were actually prophetic in nature. I mean, you read all of Wisdom chapter 2 for us. I actually got a lot of feedback on that, by the way. And
cool.
people didn't realize it. Everything that was in there.
Oh, cool.
Protestants included. So with cessation of prophecy, and when I was a Protestant too, it was the whole thing where God ceased to speak to his people.
Right.
But I don't find that likely, especially with what I read in the Deuterocanon. But I guess, how would you answer the objection that sometimes comes up? Well, Jude quotes First Enoch as prophecy, and so therefore we can't use wisdom as prophecy, or passages of Baruch or Sirach.
So let me follow your argument that because Jude quotes Enoch as a prophecy, therefore when the New Testament uses the Deuterocanon, that should be excluded. Is that what you're saying?
Right. And my apologies if I didn't state that really well at all.
It's been a long day for me, so maybe I wasn't following you.
Well, and honestly, this puppy's been keeping us up all night too. It's like having another newborn. But sometimes the argument is used. Jude quotes Enoch as prophecy, but it's not recognized as scripture. Therefore, the Deuterocanon is not scripture.
Yeah.
To me, that argument doesn't follow very well. But I guess what would you normally say with that objection? Because I've been hearing that a lot lately.
Yeah, well, it's a non sequitur, to be sure. It doesn't follow that just because Jude quotes Enoch apparently as a prophecy. And by the way, you could read that in a way that it doesn't. It doesn't follow that, therefore, whenever there's a reference to a deuterocanonical book or something, that therefore that also is pseudepigraphical or apocrypha or whatever. You have to treat it on a case-by-case basis. And ultimately, I think it comes down to which books did Jesus and his apostles hand on to the church as inspired. Mm-hmm. And it's really then that you get some clarity eventually that Enoch is not scripture, but the Deuterocanon is scripture.
Yeah, I agree. First Enoch was never included in any early list, really. Yeah. Now, is there any evidence from that time that the Deuterocanon was considered scripture, like during this so-called silence period?
Yeah. Okay. I did a video series on Apocrypha Apocalypse on this, so I actually lay out all the evidence and counter evidence. And I think what you're referring to is some of the counter evidence in the Deuterocanon. Right. Because if this was a solid, everybody believes after Malachi that was it and there's no more prophecy, you run into lots of problems because the Deuterocanon says things about prophecy continuing. And, you could even add to that some pseudepigraphic works, that were written early on that also seem to purport that God still is speaking to his people. And of course, if that was a widespread idea that cessation, prophets ceased and all prophetic writing ceased, how do you explain these writings, right? So, I'll give you a couple. Like Sirach, for example. There's 3 sections in Sirach. The first one is the Greek preface that his grandson made. And talking about his grandfather's work, he says, such a one was my grandfather Jesus, who, having devoted himself for a long time to the diligent study of the law of the prophets and the rest of our books of our ancestors, and having developed a thorough familiarity with them, was moved to write something of himself in the nature of instruction and wisdom. Now, that's interesting because he's referring to his grandfather studying scripture, and then he's moved, right, to write something of himself along the same lines, instruction and wisdom, which, by the way, is used at the beginning of Proverbs to explain what Proverbs is. It's about wisdom and instruction. Same lines, but it's like, how can you be moved to write something along the same lines as Scripture if, prophecy and writing Scripture is impossible? Another thing, too, in Sirach 24:29 through 31, although some Bibles will have it 24:31 through 33. He talks about himself, Sirach does, and he says, I said to myself, I will water my plants, my flower's bed will be drenched. And then suddenly this rivulet of mine became a river, and this stream of mine a sea. Thus do I send out my teachings forth, shining like the dawn, to become known far off. Thus do I pour out instruction like prophecy, and bestow it on generations to come. Which, William's kind of interesting, because before that he's talking about how the law is like rivers in the Garden of Eden. And then he talks about himself like opening up a tributary, right, from these waters. And he's using this to water his garden, again, kind of using that same motif. And he says that my teachings shine forth like the dawn for those who are far off. So this is for all people. And his instructions like prophecy, which is very interesting because, if prophecy was impossible, how could it be like prophecy? And it's bestowed on generations to come. So this is wisdom that's going to be accessible to all people at all time. And again, that sounds more like Scripture, or inspiration than just, human writing. And then also he describes himself in Sirach 16 through 18, where he says, now I am the last to keep vigil, like a gleaner after the vintage. Since by the Lord's blessings I have made progress, still like a vintager, I have filled my winepress. I would inform you that not for myself only have I toiled, but for every seeker after wisdom. And earlier, essentially the idea is that God's revelation is like a vineyard of vines, right? And that the prophets came and they picked revelation, they picked inspired teaching off the vine, inspired wisdom off the vine, but they left some. And so Sirach comes like a gleaner after the vintage, and he fills his basket full of whatever was left after the vintagers. Again, so he sees himself pretty much in line with the inspired writers in the Old Testament. And then if I could give one last Deuterocanonical text, it's in the Book of Wisdom 7:27. And it's speaking about God's divine wisdom. And it says, in God's divine wisdom, who is one and can do all things, and renews everything while herself perduring, and passing it to holy souls from age to age, she produces friends of God and prophets. So the Book of Wisdom understands every age to have friends of God's and prophets. But how can it be if for 4 centuries God ceased to speak to his people? So the Book of Sirach was written about 200 BC, somewhere abouts. Wisdom was a bit later, but it still falls within this area where supposedly there's no more prophets or prophecy.
Okay. Now, were all the Deuterocanonicals written within this 400-year period?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Because I had read somewhere that Baruch was, one scholar said it was written like a 531 BC. That's why I ask.
Oh, yeah. Well, it depends. It's kind of like the Book of Daniel. Some scholars will put Daniel, in Babylon, and then others will say it's during the Maccabean period. Baruch kind of falls in the same way. You could have more traditional dating, which would place him as a contemporary with the prophet Jeremiah, and others who would say it's a later writing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like you said, you covered this on your YouTube channel. It was like a 7-part series, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, man. I go into detail.
Okay, great. You do. It was a great series, by the way. But
Thanks.
one of the sources that's often used for this 400-year period is Josephus.
Yes.
And I think in part 1, you lay out that Josephus doesn't really correlate with that. Can you go over that for us?
Yeah. Well, actually, I did a series on Josephus too, so I really go.
You did.
Yeah. I mean, it's Josephus is one of the prime examples or pieces of evidence for the cessation of prophecy theory, and it comes from a single passage in his work. It's Against Appian, book 1, paragraphs 40-41. Okay. And it basically, this is what he says. He says, from the death of Moses until Artaxerxes, the king of the Persians after Xerxes, the prophets after Moses wrote history of what took place in their own time, in 13 books. The remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and instructions for the people of life, or on life. And then it says, after Artaxerxes, up to our own time, every event has been recorded, but is not judged worthy of the same trust, since the exact line of succession of prophets did not continue, unquote. So they say, see here, up to the time of Artaxerxes, which is roughly the time, of Esther and maybe Malachi, sort of, there was the succession of prophets, and Josephus affirms that. So that's identical to the Protestant canon. And then he says, but, prophets didn't continue afterwards. So there's a cessation of prophecy. And actually, if you look closely, that's not what he says. He doesn't say that after Artaxerxes, their prophets didn't continue. He says, after Artaxerxes, an exact line of succession of prophets did not continue. Okay. So remember, William, when I'm stipulating all the different things that could fit under the broad category of cessation of prophecy, one of them was that prophecy continued. Well, actually, I didn't read this. I actually have some more. That prophecy was continuous up to a point, and then it becomes discontinuous. So in my videos, what I argue is that if you look at Josephus, his work in Jewish antiquities, you see that there is a constant chronological, historical continuity from the beginning of creation all the way up to Artaxerxes. So the Old Testament gives you almost a continuous narrative, right? And then after Artaxerxes, what happens is the sources become sporadic, okay? And in his work on the antiquity of the Jews, suddenly he kind of jumps from one section to another, skipping over years. And so he understood that to mean, the prophets ceased to be in succession. But nevertheless, they still are prophets, right? In fact, there's good reason to suggest that maybe Josephus believed himself to be a prophet. Now, for Josephus, his main focus really is on prophetic or history writing prophets. That's really his focus. He's a historian, and that's when he talks about prophets, he's talking about history writing prophets. So if anything, it doesn't fit the cessation of prophecy theory, because Josephus himself, doesn't say all prophets ceased. In fact, I'll give you a quote. This is from a scholar. His name is Per Bild, and this is from Contra Appian, Studies in the Character and Context of Latin Concordance of the missing portion in Greek. It's published by Brill. And he says this, quote, he remarks only that the historical works that, quote, have not been worthy of equal credit with the earlier records because of the failure of the exact succession of prophets, unquote, that this sentence about the failure of the exact succession seems to indicate that Josephus also regarded these authors as prophets. The problem, as he saw it, was only that these prophets did not succeed each other without interruption, unquote. So, I mean, So there are historians. I don't believe he's Catholic. I believe he's Protestant. That says all Josephus is saying is that as far as the historical narrative, it's not continuous after Artaxerxes, but nevertheless, it still is prophetic. So if anything, Josephus could be said to confirm the continuation of prophecy.
Okay. So they just weren't continuous. So there wasn't like Habakkuk, Obadiah, Isaiah, but there may have been years in between type thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to understand, especially when that objection comes up. Now, is this something, is there any other, and we talked about Josephus a little bit, and that's a big one that always comes up. Are there any other sources that come up to kind of show how the cessation of prophecy really didn't happen or pokes holes in it?
Oh, within Josephus or outside?
Within or outside, whichever one.
Okay. Well, yeah. There's actually. It's interesting. Josephus himself gives lots of indication that there was prophetic inspired writings that continued. In fact, he says at the very beginning of Against Appian, the very work that has that passage in it, he says essentially, I'm quoting from memory, that he based his Antiquities of the Jews on sources, and that it covers a period of 5,000 years, I believe it is. I should probably have this up. Hold on one second. I might be able to look at it really quick. Make sure I got, like I said, it's a long day. I want to make sure I got my numbers right.
No, understand.
Yeah.
Plus it's Friday, so.
Yeah, that too. Yeah. Hopefully I can find it. But anyway, yeah, 3,000 years. Let's see. Hold on a second. Not 3,000. Okay, now I'm confusing myself. Sorry.
That's all right.
No, I think it's 5,000. It's 3,000 years from creation to the death of Moses, and then like 1,000 years from. I'm sorry, I should have had this already up. But anyway, it doesn't square. I mean, it actually comes up to the period of the Maccabees, and yet he says he's relying on sacred sources for his history. Strange things like that. Also, in his Jewish wars, he states that he's going to pick up his narrative where the prophets ceased, right? And he picks it up during the Maccabean period. He just basically kind of gives a quick rundown of what occurs during the Maccabees, and then he moves on from there. So that suggests that maybe it extended to the Maccabean period. There's all sorts of strange, things that just don't seem to fit if you try to make Josephus say all prophets and prophecy, all inspired works ceased at Artaxerxes. It just doesn't work. Yeah.
Right. I know at one point he quotes First Maccabees as sacred writing. I remember reading that.
Yeah.
So I guess, Gary, why is that objection such a, I guess, foundational to the Deuterocanon when we can see Josephus kind of contradicting that a little bit?
Well, yeah, what people would do is use that as a defeater and say, see, here's a Jewish historian writing around 100 AD, says prophets ceased after Artaxerxes, and since the Deuterocanon is written after Artaxerxes, therefore it can't be prophetic writings. And like we said, William, it's not true that you have to be a prophet to write inspired writings, right? So even then, even if that were true, it still wouldn't discount the Deuterocanon, because, if that's true, then Ezra and Nehemiah wouldn't be part of the Bible. And like I think I could argue and make a persuasive case, at least I think I do in my channel, when I look at Josephus, that if you look closely at Josephus, that's simply not what he's saying. If you hold that, then you have all sorts of weird inconsistencies with them. Here's another one too. For example, he claims that John Hyrcanus, who lived from 164 BC to 104 BC. So this is within that supposed time of silence, right, where there weren't prophets. He says that he had the gift of prophecy, and he actually conversed with God, and he wasn't ignorant of anything that comes afterwards. Well, how can you say that, Josephus, if prophets didn't exist and the gift of prophecy ceased, right?
Right.
it's just strange things like that. So usually what happens is people focus only on what he says in that one section against Appian, and then either ignore or kind of brush aside all the other things that don't fit.
Yeah, definitely. And I've noticed that as well with other arguments too, especially with like the church fathers and sola scriptura, and I guess there's no shortage of things like that.
Yeah.
So I guess it's important to read the whole document of someone, not just pick and choose.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
We could learn from that. Now, how about I've heard Philo being referenced as confirming this period of prophecy.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting, because Philo seems to affirm that inspiration continued.
I heard that argument about 2 weeks ago, and I looked it up, and I was like, "There's no way he thought this. Like, there's absolutely no way."
Yeah, in his book on the migration, chapters 34 and 35, Philo basically gives a description of his own writings as prophetically inspired. I would say whoever gives that, I would check that out. There's a Jewish scholar named Levinson who concludes that, quote, Philo experiences as he crafts their retelling bears all the marks of prophecy. His experience as he carefully recounts them contains no indication of inferiority in comparison with the experience of the Hebrew prophets. Then Levinson continues, instead of distancing himself from the prophets, then by distinguishing his experience from theirs, Philo does just the opposite. He paints his experience using the same hues as the inspiration of the prophets. So, I've never heard Philo applied to the cessation of prophecy. Usually what happens with Philo is they'll say, Philo quotes an awful lot of the Old Testament, and he never quotes from the Deuterocanon. So it's really an argument for silence. But yeah, I haven't heard that in regards to the cessation of prophecy.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear that as well, because I know he quotes a lot of the Old Testament, and even then you can kind of track it all back to the Torah.
Yeah,
the majority of it.
Yeah, it's like it's an enormous amount, 5,020 citations, and something like 20 come from outside the Torah. It's really lopsided. And needless to say, he doesn't quote from every book in the Protestant Bible.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess the whole argument, Gary, it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, is like, what is the definition of cessation of prophecy?
Yeah.
So in your experience, have you, because you've debated and everything else like that, have you run into individuals who held to any one standard over another, or have you encountered people that kind of define it all different ways?
Yeah, the thing is, they never define it. They just state it as if it's everybody knows, the thing is, if you look at all the evidence, like I try to do in my series, both for and against, usually it's only for, they rarely give counter evidence. You see that, no, what they're doing is they're taking bits and pieces that speak to different things and just kind of putting them under this general umbrella. So it's like, look at all the evidence we have that all cessation of prophecy ceased and stuff. But even their own sources that they cite, if you read the context, you find out they're not saying it at all. In fact, let me give you an example, William.
Sure.
One thing that always is cited is Barita Baba Bathra 12b. This is a rabbinic writing. Okay, it's a Barita, so it's not, it wasn't considered part of the Mishnah. It's a Jewish writing. And it says this. It says, said Rabbi Abdimi of the city of Haifa in the 3rd and 4th century, Christian century, quote, since the temple was destroyed, prophecy was taken away from the prophets and given to the wise. Okay, so they look at that and they see prophecy was taken away from the prophets. The cessation of prophets, right? But they neglect that last part. It was taken from the prophets and given to the wise. So it wasn't that prophecy ceased. It was just that prophecy was taken from one group and given to another group. So prophecy continued, just not by the prophets. And actually, if you read different translations, you find out that it's not really clear what's going on, because it says it could be interpreted as prophecy was taken away from foolish prophets and given to wise prophets. That's another way you could look at it. In that case, prophets and prophecy continued. It's just taken away from foolish prophets. But this text is one of those key texts that say, see, cessation of prophecy.
But 3 words later, contradicts it.
Exactly. Yeah, just cut it off right there. Forget that it's given to the wise, and you look closely at the evidence, and it's either falls apart or it says something that doesn't quite square with how the traditional cessation of prophecy is given. Right. Yeah.
Gary, when did this objection start to the Deuterocanon?
Well, yeah, when did it first start? Earliest would probably be Julius Africanus in the 4th century, or is it 3rd century, who was a contemporary of Origen. He was the first one. His problem was really he believed that the Deuterocanonical sections of Daniel wasn't Hebrew, so he thought it was spurious. And Origen says no, it's part of the scriptures that are read in church, so it's not. And of course, you have the first person to say the Deuterocanon is Apocrypha, appears to be St. Jerome in the late 4th century. No other early church father calls it Apocrypha or assigns it to the Apocrypha. As far as the cessation of prophecy theory, it came out, it's post-Christian. It's claimed to be there in Josephus, which I don't believe it is. It's claimed to be part of the rabbinic literature, and I don't believe it is. I think it's kind of a one-sided reading of that literature. So I have a feeling it's rather late. I haven't been able to trace exactly when.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it's in the it's later in it's in the Christian area. It's Christian era, not area. Yeah. Sorry, everyone. It's in the Christian era where it came about.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
And this is when the Deuterocanon was already being read in the liturgies and everything else too.
Oh, yeah, sure, yeah, absolutely. Even a lot of the rabbinic texts are from the 3rd, 4th Christian century or later. So, this is well after the Christian church has pretty much defined the contents of Scripture officially, and I think it kind of, what happened was, once this idea that the Protestant canon is the truth and there's this period of 400 years, I think that became datum. That silence became datum in which people could say, well, see, we could find all kinds of evidence we could plug into to support this idea that there were 400 years of silence. I don't think it really comes from the data itself. I think it's something more that's kind of constructed by others.
So they're looking at everything with their viewpoint already in mind, how they want to get there, and they're kind of constructing their argument to fit that hole.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because if you look at each piece individually, it, like I said, it either falls apart or it says something about a change in prophecy that just doesn't square with any standard explanation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Gary, what's coming up next on your channel? I watched the most recent one. Did the Maccabees pray to the damned? That was a good one.
It was a damned good video, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, I think next I'm going to talk about the historic Protestant Bible. Is my copy of Scripture identical to the Bible that the early reformers had? And then I'll probably follow that up with another video about how is it that Protestant Bibles today are missing books that the early Protestants always had between their covers.
All right. Well, great work on that channel. That channel again is Apocrypha Apocalypse. And of course, I encourage everyone to check out his daily show on Virgin Most Powerful Radio, Hands on Apologetics. Well, Gary, how could our listeners get a hold of you if they wanted to ask any more questions? Because I know we're just scratching the surface here.
Oh, sure. Yeah, you can always shoot me an email at questions@handsonapologetics.com. And also, I want to point out that next Wednesday, the 9th, I believe it's the 9th. Let me make sure. We're going to have a very special guest in the dojo, which is none other than the host, William Hemsworth, right?
Too kind.
Yes. So that's certainly a market calendars. Oh, it's the 10th. March 10th. And that's it.
All right. Well, Gary, as always, I thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me.
God bless you.